Your horse does something that shouldn't make sense. It grabs a fence and pulls air into its mouth, over and over. Scientists have just discovered something highly interesting about why this happens. Instead, horse owners have spent decades in punishing them for doing it, and even used devices to make them stop. So almost everything we believe about this behavior is built on a complete myth. The latest research reveals something completely different is actually happening. And once you understand the science, you'll probably never look at the same way again. In today's episode, we're talking about cribbing. Let's start with what cribbing actually is, at a behavioral level. The horse grips a fixed surface with its incisors, contracts the muscles in the lower neck, and draws in air across the back of the throat. That grunt you hear is the airflow being pulled through the oropharynx. The horse is not actually swallowing air into the stomach, which is a common misconception. It's a pressurized pull through the upper airway. It's classified as a stereotypy, a repetitive, largely invariant behavior pattern that appears to serve no direct function. Stereotypies appear across many species kept in captive or restricted environments: zoo animals, pigs in confined systems, laboratory rodents. They are not specific to horses. They are a response to a particular kind of environment. That matters because cribbing has never been observed in free-ranging feral horses. Not once. It is, without exception, a behavior that develops in domesticated management conditions, which already tells you something important about where to look when you want to understand it. The three myths that do the most damage are the contagion myth, the vice myth, and the just stop it myth. We'll take them in order. Myth 1. Cribbing is contagious. This is probably the most persistent belief, and the one that causes the most practical harm. Horses removed from barns, isolated, or fitted with expensive prevention devices because owners fear they'll teach the behavior to others. A 2009 Cornell University survey of more than 3,500 U.S. horses found that 48.8% of owners believed cribbing was a learned behavior. But only 1% of horses in that same survey had actually developed cribbing after exposure to a cribbing horse. In a population where the general prevalence is between 2 and 8% across Europe and North America, that 1% is essentially noise. What looks like contagion in a barn, several horses in adjacent stalls all cribbing, is almost always explained by something else. Shared stressors, shared management practices, shared genetics in a breeding barn, or simply the fact that the conditions that produce cribbing in one horse are the same conditions present for the horses next door. The behavior clusters because the cause clusters, not because horses watch each other and copy. Myth 2. Cribbing is a vice. The word vice implies a moral dimension that has no place in a behavioral discussion. Cribbing isn't a decision the horse makes. It's something the brain has learned to do in response to a set of conditions, and by the time it's established, it has a neurological basis that has nothing to do with the horse's temperament, training history, or relationship with its owner. In 2005, scientists measured dopamine receptor patterns in cribbing and non-cribbing horses post-mortem. Cribbing horses had significantly more D1 and D2 dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward and motivation center, and significantly fewer D1 receptors in the caudate nucleus, a structure involved in action-outcome learning. What this means practically? Cribbing activates the brain's reward pathway. It generates a real neurochemical response. The horse isn't doing it out of boredom in the casual sense. It's doing it because it works. It produces a measurable reduction in stress hormones. It's a coping mechanism that has become, in a neurological sense, self-reinforcing. And now, the part that answers the question from the beginning. A 2015 study compared cognitive performance in cribbing horses versus non-cribbers and horses with locomotor stereotypies. The cribbing horses showed different learning profiles, and in specific cognitive tasks, they outperformed the control group. The altered dopamine wiring that drives cribbing appears to also lower the brain's reward threshold for learning, making certain associations form faster. So, smarter? The honest answer is more nuanced than that. Different. Wired differently. But trainers and owners who work regularly with cribbing horses consistently describe them as quick to pick things up, attentive, and capable. The brain differences associated with cribbing don't produce a dull horse. The picture is considerably more complicated than the stigma suggests. Myth 3. You should stop it. This is where the traditional response, the cribbing collar, the anti-cribbing straps, the electrified fence rails, collides directly with what we now know about what cribbing does for the horse. If cribbing is a stress coping mechanism, one that actively reduces cortisol and generates a dopamine reward, then physically preventing it doesn't address the stress. It removes the coping tool and leaves the stress in place. In 1998, it was also shown that short-term physical prevention of cribbing increased behavioral agitation in the horses studied. It interrupts the regulatory cycle the horse has built and does nothing about the conditions that drove the behavior in the first place. There's also a welfare dimension worth naming directly. Cribbing collars work by causing discomfort when the horse attempts to arch its neck. You are adding a pain stimulus to a horse that is already under enough chronic stress to have developed a stereotype. That is not a neutral intervention. Now for the science behind why it develops in the first place, because that's where the management lever actually is. Cribbing almost always develops around weaning. Research by Waters and colleagues in 2002 found that young thoroughbreds and part thoroughbreds weaned abruptly and immediately placed on high-concentrate diets were 4 times more likely to develop cribbing than those given continued access to roughage. Diet at weaning is one of the strongest predictors identified in the literature. There's a well-documented link between cribbing and gastric acidity. Horses' stomachs produce acid continuously, and in a horse with limited forage access, that acid has nothing to buffer it. The act of cribbing increases saliva production, which is alkaline and helps neutralize stomach acid. Some researchers believe the behavior begins as a gut-driven response, the horse discovering that doing this thing makes the discomfort in its stomach slightly better. Which means that in many cases, the foundation of cribbing management is not the horse's head, it's the horse's gut. So what do you do instead? The first and most important intervention is forage. Constant access to hay or pasture is the single most evidence-based management tool for cribbing horses. It keeps the gut occupied, buffers stomach acid continuously, and reduces the low-level digestive discomfort that many cribbers are trying to manage through the behavior itself. Slow feeders, hay nets with small holes, late-night hay top-ups, whatever it takes to extend the time between forage gaps. Reduce concentrate feed, especially for young horses and horses in early training. High-starch, high-sugar diets increase gastric acid production and have been consistently associated with higher rates of cribbing. Forage should always come first. Social contact and movement are the other 2 major variables. Cribbing is consistently more prevalent in horses stabled for long periods with limited turnout and limited interaction with other horses. Turnout with other horses is not a luxury for a cribber, it's one of the primary tools. If the cribbing is frequent, compulsive, or worsening, get the gut examined. Gastric ulcers are more common in cribbing horses than in the general population, and treating an active ulcer can significantly reduce the drive to crib, especially in horses where the behavior has appeared recently or escalated. If your horse already has an established cribbing habit, be realistic. The behavior rarely disappears entirely once it's neurologically embedded. That's not a management failure. What good management does is reduce the frequency and compulsivity, and reduce the underlying stress that drives it. A horse that cribbs occasionally but is otherwise relaxed and easy to work is in a very different state than one cribbing for hours without stopping. One more thing worth naming. The stigma around cribbing costs horses more than it should. Horses are removed from sales, devalued, and rejected from boarding facilities because of a behavior that doesn't make them worse to work with, doesn't reliably spread to other horses, and in many cases coexists with strong performance and trainability. A horse that's well managed enough not to need to crib constantly is more relaxed and easier to work than one wearing a collar and fighting the urge all day. The goal was never to hide the behavior. It was always to address the cause. So if your horse is cribbing, the right question is, what the environment is asking too much of that horse, not how to make it stop. That reframe doesn't just help the horse, it usually produces better outcomes for the owner too. If you have a cribber, or if you've ever wondered whether you're making the right call with one, drop a comment and tell us what you've tried. And if you want to go deeper on how stress shows up in horse behavior more broadly, the video on early stress signals is linked right here. Subscribe if you haven't already.